will say this. What Van Hollen is doing is at least something. No offense to Cory Booker, who, talked for 25 hours. That isn't actually anything. It's a cool symbol. I'm glad he broke Strom Thurmond's record, but that's nothing. This is action.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Reginald Bärris, joined as always by my co-host, Singh. Introduce yourself.
Why, hello everyone, it's me.
This week's nightmare, the Trump administration is sending immigrants to foreign prisons without due process. And we're here to answer the question on all of our minds. Can they just do that? But first, a word from our sponsors. This week's episode is sponsored by our patrons at patreon.com/dothatpod. Basically, right now, the show is free for everyone but us. And we're just some broke boy comedians, so it all adds up very quickly. There's equipment, hosting fees, other production costs, yada, yada, yada. And right now, Sid and I are going out of pocket to foot that bill. But by joining our patreon.com/dothatpod, you can get early access to videos and even get your name in the credits as a Patreon producer. Our goal here at Can They Just Do That is to help you make sense of the news and know your rights. And if you'd like to support us in that goal, we would love to welcome you in to our patreon.com/dothatpod. Link is in the description. Back to the show. The Trump administration has been sending immigrants that they purport are affiliated with Latin American gangs to some of the worst prisons in El Salvador.
Like most things with the Trump administration, this roundup has been poorly done, with many of the detainees arrested despite having never actually been convicted of violent crimes.
And most of the detainees were denied due process and denied the right to submit a habeas corpus petition.
Recent court cases have now followed one man named Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, a father of three living in Maryland and married to a U.S. citizen. Abrego Garcia was part of the roundup from the Trump administration that sent him to El Salvador without due process.
Apparently, Abrego Garcia was previously found to have entered the country illegally years prior. However, a judge at the time had also ruled that he had a credible reason to fear for his life in El Salvador, thus barring the U.S. government from sending him back there.
In court filings, the Trump administration has admitted that including him in the first place was ultimately an administrative error.
As a result, the district court judge has ordered Trump's administration to return Abrego Garcia.
The Trump administration defied the judge's orders, saying that his order was given when the plane was over international waters and out of the judge's jurisdiction.
However, an appeals court judge found that the judge's orders were in fact lawful and should have been followed.
The Trump administration next argued that Abrego Garcia was already in El Salvadorian prison and they had no jurisdiction to release him. Instead, they actually argued
that while the United States concedes the removal out to El Salvador was an administrative error, that does not license district courts to seize control over foreign relations and treat the executive branch as a subordinate diplomat and demand the United States let a member of foreign terrorist organization into America. Clearly, I respect this position.
Under oath, the government's own lawyer was asked why the U.S. couldn't ask El Salvador to return this man. He said he didn't know. It was actually the first thing he asked when he got the case. And because he admitted this in court, he was later suspended, and then so was his supervisor.
Then the Supreme Court got involved, first with a 6-3 ruling that removed the initial deadline for returning Abrego Garcia, giving themselves more time to review the entire case in the meantime.
Then, after reviewing the entire case, the Supreme Court unanimously sided with Abrego Garcia, and they've now ordered the Trump administration to return him. They further ordered that henceforth the Trump administration must allow for all future deportation targets to be given their full due process.
However, as of recording, it remains unclear if the Trump administration will listen to this ruling.
Right before recording this episode, the Trump administration was filmed in an interview with President Bukele of El Salvador, where both basically laughed at the idea of returning him to the United States.
There's so much to unpack here, and before we get into the nitty-gritty, there are a few caveats that I'd like to lead with. First and foremost, the ICE agents are detaining people under the pretense of the detainees being affiliated with gangs, notably MS-13 and Tren de Aragua. In many of these cases, the people have no local criminal record in America, and there's no evidence of gang affiliation, but even if it were, Simply being affiliated with a gang is not a crime in itself. But that being said, even if it were true that that were a crime in itself, these people are not being given the due process to adequately assess whether or not they are or aren't gang affiliated. Even worse, there have been specific instances where ICE acknowledges that they have made a mistake regarding the target's legal status, or that it was confirmed they had the wrong person, or that they condemned people on the basis that they had a tattoo, including a Real Madrid football tattoo. In all of these cases, they arrested these people anyway. We are currently living in a world where plainclothes ICE officers are rounding people up out of their homes, off the street, without identifying themselves or their agency, or saying where they're taking these detainees, which is arguably indiscernible from kidnapping. And if that wasn't nightmare enough, the U.S. government has deported more than 200 people to El Salvador without proving or even demonstrating that they've committed a crime. And I gotta ask, can they do that? Can they send people without proving they've done a crime?
Yeah, I've never had an easier and harder time to research for an episode, because there really is a thing where you're like, this is so clearly not legal or normal. If someone has not committed a crime and hasn't overstayed their valid length of time in the United States, there is no legal basis to deport them. What the Trump administration is doing is insane.
Yeah, and I ultimately did, it was a long caveat, but I put that there because I feel like that needs to be the headline regardless of where we go with the rest of this conversation. But obviously, for the sake of discussion, we're going to get into the kind of hypothetical nitty-gritty of where are the lines and the boundaries of how could it be legal, what could be legal. But like, first and foremost, it is indefensible what's going on right now. But yeah, even if we stipulated that, it's still worth noting that many of the deportees weren't even from the destination country. So can the government do that? Can they deport to a third country, in this case, El Salvador, that the people do not necessarily even have a connection to?
So I think, unfortunately, with most legal things, the answer is that it depends. But in most cases, this is actually legal. Very few of the suspected gang members are from El Salvador. But under U.S. immigration law, a country such as El Salvador can accept someone deported from the United States who isn't a citizen of that country if the person's homeland refuses to accept them. So theoretically, let's say you have someone from Venezuela. That person can be deported to El Salvador if it's proven that there's no safe way to deport them to Venezuela. The bigger issue is, of course, that you need someone like El Salvador to agree to take them in the first place, which unfortunately it feels like happened here.
And I am curious because I don't know all the details. In this instance, were all of the home countries of the deportees contacted, or was El Salvador just used as a de facto destination for everyone, regardless of their origin?
Well, this is where it gets tricky, because I think it really comes down to how much you ultimately believe the Trump administration and how much it matters when they say things like they are now forced to facilitate someone's release, which, spoiler alert, will come up later. I think the most honest answer we can give is that it's very likely these countries were not actually contacted in any realistic way. If they were, it was almost probably assumed that they were going to say no, or probably were even coerced into saying no. Not that most of these countries want these people in the first place. I mean, there's a reason they fled those countries. What's more likely is that, if I may put my conspiracy hat on, it's that the United States probably has a deal with El Salvador, which pays El Salvador quite a bit of money if they can get up to a certain amount of people contained. And they're not really asking a lot of questions if it helps them get to that number.
Honestly, that does not even sound like that much of a stretch for a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
That feels almost a fact. I mean, if you're just looking at the vibes in the Oval Office with Bukele and Trump, we're so clearly that. It's one guy posturing literally as the world's coolest dictator. We truly are living in an era that is it is the Andrew Tate approach to dictatorship as well.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I know that the crux of this show is to get to the bottom of the legal truth, find out what they do and don't have the right to do, and are they right, are they wrong? And I'm always scared with some of these questions that I'm going to be disappointed.
Yeah, sure.
I'm like, can they do that? And I'm always in my head being secretly, please no, please no. But with that in mind, is there legal truth when they say that they can't get them back once they're on the plane over international waters? It feels like the villain in an 80s movie screaming diplomatic immunity. and without it having any real.
So not only is this a nonsensical answer, first of all, to be very clear, the judge ordered this plane back before it flew into international waters, which I think is a part of this that often gets lost. In fact, what actually happened is he verbally ordered them to get the plane back immediately, which is normally seen as just as valid as a written order. Because as we know, a stenographer is typing all of this up as it happens, so there's plenty of records. The judge then sent back a written request saying that you have to turn the plane around, which is at that point when they said they were over international waters. However, it ignores the fact, who do you think is flying these planes? Obviously, it is a U.S. pilot who could have turned the plane around at any moment. It's such a laughable statement that is really hoping that no one Googles anything.
Yeah, it's one of those things where they act like every crime is legal once you're flying above international which I also maybe I'm wrong here. I feel like international waters only applies if you're in the waters. That feels like there's a different term for being in international airspace, but it is typically a thing. Even when you deal with, like, if you're on a cruise and someone gets murdered on a cruise, that doesn't make it legal. It typically gets associated with where was the plane or the cruise chartered from, which country is there's choices within that hold people accountable. And at the end of the day, if a U.S. citizen who is supposed to be holding up the executive branch's responsibility to respond to the court's ruling, then it doesn't matter where you're at, in my opinion. But I guess I don't know the full extent. So out of curiosity, I don't know if you know this, when does it stop? When they land, does it change? Or is it just once the people are in custody of El Salvadorian officials? Where does the responsibility technically stop?
So these are the kind of gray areas in international law that tend to be case by case. I mean, it gets even weirder when you factor in the fact that the law would likely be different if these were citizens of the United States. If they were citizens of the United States would likely think it had jurisdiction over them everywhere. Well, maybe not in every instance, but enough to be like, if you're under international waters, the plane's coming back. I guess their argument is that once it touches down on foreign soil, it is El Salvador's problem. Once it's in international waters, it's no one's problem. And once it's in America and the judge is only saying things verbally, I mean, how are they supposed to know that the judge didn't have an accent?
He probably wrote in cursive and they were like, I don't trust him.
Wow, what a very long way to sign a check.
Even still, with all that in mind, like, once they're there, okay, now officially, I guess, if we did concede, we messed up, we made a boo-boo, and it's not technically within our power, the executive branch still has been ordered to facilitate a return for the deported individuals. But because nothing is ever simple, especially not when lawyers are involved, this has led to a lot of very petty semantic quibbling about the difference between facilitating a return versus effectuating a return and the responsibilities imparted by each of those wordings. In that Oval Office discussion with Bukele, Trump was saying, well, we can't go to El Salvador and remove an El Salvadorian citizen. That'd be aggression towards El Salvador. Facilitating, according to Trump, means we'll give him a plane. But then Bukele's response is, well, I can't send a terrorist back to America. Right. I can't smuggle a terrorist in. But it's like, hey, man, you're both saying these things, but they can't both be true at the same time. If the U.S. is facilitating the transport with its own plane, you aren't smuggling anything.
Yeah, so here's where it gets a little bit weird. So I'll defend the Trump administration's position in this way, which is that essentially the argument of the judge is you cannot trust El Salvador. A judge in 2019 very clearly said this man would not be safe if returned to El Salvador. Therefore, we need to keep this man safe from El Salvador. But effectively, that basically means Trump is now in a room where the position the judges are, I think, rightfully asking him to say is to look the El Salvadorian president in the face and be like, well, obviously we can't trust you. There's no way he's going to be safe in your country. So now we need to bring him back, which I get is an awkward conversation to have when the guy is, 2 feet next to you, especially when you're paying him so much money to house your prisoners. But ultimately, this is it's a nerdy thing. The difference between effectuate and facilitate, in the real world are not big deals.
A distinction without a difference.
In the legal world, unfortunately, where words have to be very carefully defined and based on precedent, I think you can argue that, to facilitate a return basically means do what you can to return him should you have a chance to do so, whereas effectuate would basically be the judge being like, put pressure on this government to do what you need to do. And that's technically not something he's allowed to do. But again, this comes back to a very basic issue. The Trump administration deported a guy, let's pretend, on accident, and now they're acting like they can't return him, which is even crazier because it was reported just 3 days ago they've already returned 8 different prisoners from this prison.
Really?
Yes.
What is the reasoning for this one? Is it just political?
I believe they're Venezuelan women, so I think it was not. I think it was proven that it was not safe to something. It was proven that it was not safe to be in El Salvador, and they weren't El Salvadorians, so I skimmed it, to be honest. But it was the basic point is that they're capable of returning people. So that's why I think they're like, well, we couldn't. I mean, he's a Venezuelan, he's an El Salvadorian citizen. Look,
and I will say too, I certainly, it's why I said at the beginning, I'm like, I get it. That I can't argue with the fact that they are quibbling over it because that is how law works. It is just very frustrating quibble to see. And it's also kind of a shame they couldn't get a more. I feel like judges know that lawyers quibble. Give them less to quibble about would make me feel a little bit happier about the situation, because obviously they are going to. We are dealing right now with an administration that is going to quibble even when they don't have the right to quibble. So when you give them actual, legitimate semantic issues to hide behind, then it's I don't know. I just don't like I don't like when they are given any more leash than they need to be because they're willing to bite anyway, But I do think that when you say that Trump's position is a little bit difficult because you have to look him in the eye and say, we don't believe he's safe there. I see that argument. I also feel like there are other ways a tactful person could say it, where it's just like, hey, we made an oopsie. Please give him back. The issue I could see Trump feeling is that ultimately it comes down to Trump doesn't want to be seen as being in a position of weakness, even when they have made mistakes. I mean, to be extremely clear, and I can't stress this enough, despite my previous argument, I don't care. Hey man, you're the president. I don't know if you know this, but sometimes the president has to have awkward conversations. Awkward conversations.
Kind of comes with the job, buddy. Feels like
I'm just a small bean president.
I know. It's just not an argument. I mean, especially a president who sees himself as a king. I feel like he should be able to handle this request. Especially a president that sees himself as the master of the art of the deal. Yeah.
I think that even more than king is like, hey man, aren't you so good at negotiating? Figure it out.
I gotta be honest. It's so scary if this works. Because, what's interesting? Before, this is a slight tangent, but I think it's an important one, is that before he was president the second time, it was found that Trump would do this thing where he would evaluate his buildings that he owned, real estate deals, where when it came time to pay taxes, the holdings were worth one number. But when it came time to get loans based off of those buildings, the buildings were actually worth 10 or 100 times that price. And it feels like he's doing that now for the powers of the presidency, where when he's at a press conference or when he's at a rally, he's like, oh my God, I can do whatever I want. I'm a king and you're going to let me. But then in legal courts, he's like, well, there's nothing I can do.
Again, I think one of the biggest disservices anybody can do when discussing anything that the Trump administration is doing is to even theoretically concede or that they're doing anything in good faith.
I think that is a lesson that if we don't learn soon, it's going to be far, far too late to turn the ship around ever.
Yeah. But before we go down that doom spiral...
Thanks for listening, everyone! Sponsored by our Patreon!
But I will ask, because earlier we did mention the habeas corpus and that the detainees were entitled to be able to submit a habeas corpus position. But I think most of us have no idea what that is, myself included. I'm just reading from a teleprompter. So, Sid, since you went to law school, can you please explain to us what a habeas corpus petition is and why it's important?
Sure. A habeas corpus petition, or a habeas petition as it's more commonly referred to, it's a remedy by which a report can be made to a court alleging the unlawful detention or imprisonment of an individual and requesting that the court order the individual's custodian to bring the prisoner to court to determine whether their detention is lawful. It's basically as simple as being like, hey, this person doesn't deserve to be in this roundup. You've taken him by mistake. Or, hey, this person that you've arrested, you have no basis to arrest him. To hold him in a jail cell when he's done nothing wrong sure feels like an infringement on his rights.
What I think I know about habeas corpus is that it's Latin for produce the body. Is that correct, Sid?
Yeah, it's basically a lawyer saying produce the body instead of hiding it in some jail cell where he's left to rot. The main reason that these habeas petitions are getting even more important is just because in cases like this is one of the biggest parts of due process that so many of these people rounded up are lacking. To quote Sonia Sotomayor, the implication of the government's position is that not only non-citizens, but also United States citizens could be taken off the streets, forced onto planes, and confined to foreign prisons with no opportunity for redress if judicial review is denied unlawfully before removal, which basically means, hey, listen, right now, you're taking legal residents off the streets without any chance for them to prove their innocence, which means you could also take citizens off the streets. And when you go, no, they wouldn't take a citizen, you go, well, why not? Well, they go, well, I would prove it to them. I'd be like, no, you wouldn't get the chance to do that. That's the whole point.
Exactly. And obviously it should be said that it's bad even if it's only happening to non-citizens. But like that implication should be terrifying for everyone, because Trump has already candidly said that he would be all for the idea of sending the general prison population, primarily comprising American citizens, to foreign prisons. And is he just candidly yapping? Quite frankly, again, it doesn't matter. This isn't a slippery slope. This is a gradual off-ramp with the landscape they're cultivating. And they're discussing these things so flippantly. It's like, if the price is right, I mean, you have to check about the law, but I'd be all for the idea of sending these people. That sounds egregiously illegal, but is there any precedent of just deporting American citizens to a foreign country? Or is there a certain area where there's a legal pathway for them to do that in the future?
So not only is this not legal, the closest analogies I could come to, here's the thing. As the executive branch, which the president is a part of, has gotten more powerful over the years, they've done some really weird stuff. You know, previously we would force situations where there was no due process with Americans who were being sent to Guantanamo Bay and not given a lawyer, right? So that'd be one example of a time when George Bush, after 9/11, would do somewhat similar things, although even then they had more due process than they do now because they would still be allowed to file habeas petitions. Although not, you know, again, from Guantanamo Bay without a lawyer, it's tough.
Yeah, not effectively, but they could file and ceremoniously do that.
Right. Similarly, there was a U.S. citizen in Yemen who Obama drone striked. Well, I actually wrote a paper on him when I was at Oxford, and it basically comes down to this where it's like, essentially the U.S. was arguing that he was an enemy combatant because he was effectively recruiting for, I think, either ISIS or some similar, like, you know, affiliated group. And the problem is that's an argument for why he should have been given a court date and due process and not drone striked out of the air. So one could argue that is technically worse than what Trump is putting forward. But, you know, really, there's a good chance for arguing between a slow death and a quick death. So, you know, what a fun conversation.
I mean, particularly with Bärris Garcia, where the as previously ruled, the prospect of him dying in El Salvador is non-zero and probably significantly more than non-zero if they're able to offer a non-refoulement. I know I've said that wrong. So you told me last night that it's a non-refoulement because it's French. And but yeah, it probably worth us just saying the word you're hearing. Picture the word refoulement and know that it's the same concept. So this is actually a really important principle in international law. And the idea of it is very simple, right? Which is that if you know that sending someone to a third country or just a different country would result in them being harmed, you can't send them there. So, for example, a lot of times when someone is applying for asylum, concurrently they will apply for an exception known under the CAT statute. The CAT is the Convention Against Torture. The Convention Against Torture is very simple. If you have a decent chance of knowing this person will be hurt, which I think is like 10% roughly, if you think there's even a 10% chance that this person, don't quote me on that. Oh, it's that low.
But it's
not It's not 100%. It's not close.
It doesn't have to be 100%. Doesn't have to be close to be 100%. That this person has a chance at being in danger should you send him back. You cannot send him back. You cannot knowingly send someone to their death.
Well, big asterisk on that one. Just we're not going to get into it, but big asterisk.
Right. Here's the basic issue with what Stephen Miller is arguing. Stephen Miller is arguing that the judge in 2019 who ruled that Garcia should not be sent back to El Salvador, that should no longer apply because the judge in 2019 basically ruled that Garcia ran a pupuseria, which is a food stall, and a gang was basically targeting his business, and he fled for his life to come to America to avoid getting murdered. Stephen Miller is arguing that that no longer applies because that gang no longer exists. However, if that gang no longer exists, it's probably because he's in a maximum detention facility like the one Garcia's in, which means there's a very good chance if you are saying the gang is no longer in existence on the streets of El Salvador, but they are in the jails of El Salvador, and you send this guy to the jail of El Salvador, you have made things worse.
Place.
Yes.
It's the worst place you could choose.
Yes.
Because I do think it's worth pointing out, and I know this is me quibbling, but I do think that, like, it's already bad enough if we just looked at this like an exile and they said, hey, you don't get to come back to America. We're taking you, putting you on a plane, sending you to El Salvador, and then once you're there, you're on your own. You can't come back to America. Is already pretty bad. Yeah. That's not good. You're taken from all your assets. You're taken from your family. That's already terrible, even if you retained your freedom while there. So then take you and say, hey, I know that yesterday you were doing literally nothing wrong, but like get out. And now you're in one of the worst prisons in the world.
Yeah, it's This is, I think this is the darkest episode we've ever done. And we've only done 4, but I think this is really setting...
I will say that, because we touched on this earlier, with Trump talking about what powers they do and don't have, and ultimately I can do whatever I want, and the unsaid thing is I don't want to do this, and therefore I can't. It is worth talking about, again, the actual powers of the government. I know Sid's mantra on all these episodes is, did you guys notice the executive branch is getting bigger? He's looking at it like a comet coming down from the sky that we all thought was the moon, and it's like, I think it's getting bigger, but the government is supposed to be all about checks and balances to keep any individual branch from seizing unbalanced power. But the Trump administration does keep asserting that forcing them to abide by this judge's orders would supplant the executive branch's authority in foreign relations specifically. Now, I suspect I know the answer, but is there any legitimacy to that argument?
There really isn't. And I think there's another Sonia Sotomayor quote that really sends us home, which is that, to quote her, the government's argument, moreover, implies that it could deport and incarcerate any person, including U.S. citizens, without legal consequences, so long as it does so before a court can intervene. That view refutes itself. And it really does. I mean, you just cannot argue that we have unilateral authority so long as we are deporting people outside the country.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, their legal, the Trump administration's legal stance is better to ask for apologies than permission.
But also, it's worse, right? Because once the apologies are given, they're not accepted.
I mean, let's be real. Anybody who's taking that philosophy doesn't actually care if you accept their apology.
That's true. It's also just, and I think as we move on to the next segment, which is for us to discuss the politics of this, it's really frustrating because at the very least, what used to restrain Republicans, and I think maybe this is instructive in terms of what the Trump presidency views for America long term, but it used to be that conservatives would have some fear of adding power to the executive branch because they knew eventually Democrats would come into power as well. And once they got to use the powers they had just given the executive, they would be in danger. If you can deport suspected rapists and criminals to whatever country you feel like, boy, what do you think we're going to do to a convicted sex criminal like Donald Trump? I mean, honestly, it's and just to add to it, if I can just end this frustration point, the most frustrating thing is that we know the Democrats would never do that. And boy, does that make it that much more frustrating that they are willing to bend the laws to get whatever conservative thing they want, but our side refuses to do the same, except, of course, for their sons every once in a while.
Yeah, so because we are talking about politics, and, obviously the crux of this show is about the law and are they allowed to do it? But I think we make no efforts to hide our political views and our political stances on these issues. So from your perspective, why politically is this happening in the way that it's happening? I have my opinions and I'm sure we largely agree, but let's get it on wax.
It really comes down to this, right? The Trump administration is trying to see what they can get away with to see if they can go further. I think one of the reasons that they took someone, I think they chose Garcia on purpose, to be 100% frank. I think they chose him on purpose because they basically wanted to say that if we can deport a legal resident who has no basis for deportation, I think we can start to deport those student protesters. I think once we start deporting those student protesters, I think we can start to deport citizens who are proven criminals. I think once we start to deport citizens that are proven criminals, we can start to deport citizens who have made online posts we disagree with. They are going after every single person they think they can go after in order to gain as much power for themselves as possible.
It's worth noting with that they already have said that Mahmoud can be deported, you know, and obviously he's not the only one, but it's like there's been progress on that as well. And it has been disheartening, to say the least. You were telling me last night there was somebody who was detained during their citizenship ceremony. They were like 4 words away from becoming a citizen, and then they were detained as only a legal resident instead to be shipped off.
This is a real problem. It's like, you know, this Secot prison in El Salvador is somehow worse than that Louisiana prison, which I think is why we are focusing on Garcia today. But it bears mentioning that the prisons in Louisiana are not a picnic either. And we are sending so many lawful residents of our country. That's nuts.
Yeah. I mean, again, to look back at Mahmoud specifically, where it's like he got arrested in Manhattan and the next day or within 48 hours, he's in Louisiana. What?
And it's crazier than that, right? It's crazier than that because there is a ICE facility or even just a deportation center in New Jersey. So they sent him to Louisiana because they're trying to deny his ability to have any habeas petitions. They are doing what they can to make this as administratively tough as possible while pretending to be the kinds of people who make a lot of administrative mistakes.
Yeah, it is basically the government equivalent of a toddler seeing a glass on the counter and just going over and poking it and pushing it slowly closer and closer to the edge. Every time checking back to look you in the eye to see what your reaction is before they knock it onto the ground and then say, oops, I didn't know. And it's like the longer you let them get away with any of these individual steps, it's not a slippery slope because they're demonstrating already. It has been less than 3 months since, as of recording, it is just under 3 months since Trump was inaugurated. And so much has happened so quickly, and the degradation of like what we started here and ended up here has already demonstrated that it's a steep slope, even if you put a glue trap on it.
They really are toddlers, and that's why this episode is actually sponsored this week by condoms. Condoms. The more you wear them, the less toddlers there are.
And that's why this week we'll be sponsoring an abortion in America.
Hey, abortions, get them while you can. That's of course a different episode, guys, that we'll be saving for a few weeks from now.
But yeah, ultimately there's so much of this administration that it is just cruelty for the sake of cruelty to see how much they can get away with. And they are loving it. It is upsetting. It is so wild to me that the White House is posting what it is. And look, I have no, who cares who's in office? You have to respect the office. Look, I get it. I understand he has the powers, whatever. I don't have to like him or what he does. But it is wild how much the fact that Trump is helming this administration has taken away all of the government officials' sentiment for like feeling like they need to uphold any amount of decorum.
Yes.
And obviously decorum it is not the most important thing ever. I think liberals and Democrats take decorum to be far more important than I think it is. At the end of the day, I don't care how politely you did nothing, but I think that like there's no pretense of this not just being some guy in charge of a Twitter account. When you look at like the Trump the mock-up of the Trump as a king, being like a Time magazine cover with Trump as a king, or you look at the heinous things they posted with like the deportation ASMR, where they're rattling chains and showing people's lives being torn apart as they're forced out of the country without due process. And they're just relishing in the idea of, ooh, isn't this so funny and cute and kitschy? And it's like this idea of normalizing you to see these things and not treat them as the heinous things they are.
Yes.
And they're just openly doing it. And people aren't reacting like that's crazy for the White House to be doing it. Do I expect a post like that to come out somewhere? Sure. Do I expect a Trump Gaza AI video to come out somewhere? It's inevitable. But they shouldn't be the ones reposting them. Yeah. That's insane. So, Sid, in conclusion, can they just do that?
So not only can they not normally do this, this is a literal constitutional crisis. This is the most important episode we have done, which sounds gross because we're both comedians and the word important shouldn't come out of our mouths. But this is the most important crisis in our lifetimes. I truly believe, in as far as the Constitution is concerned, there is no basis for the executive branch to ignore the judicial branch. We got to do something.
Yeah. And obviously, like, it's like we're both comedians. I think what you did was important. This is not a funny show. This show is not, do we laugh at times? Sure. But like, it's not, the main goal of this, it is a weird branding issue. It's like two comedians coming. Don't make you laugh once. This is more, truly, it's why I start each episode. I forgot this one, but I'm here as a concerned citizen. This is not me being like, oh, this will help my comedy career. Oh, I want to say all these things that I want to say on stage. I don't want to say most of this on stage. This is just stuff that makes me very upset on a daily basis. Yeah. And I just want to put something out there to counter some of the narratives that we're hearing. And like, if 3 people see it, which is about the number of views we get, then that's done something, hopefully. But yeah, this one's bad. I mean, I think this is not too much darker than the Mahmoud one because it's all kind of the same vein.
Right.
But it is a deepening of an issue that's already terrifying.
I think the difference between this and the Mahmoud one, which makes this so important, is that technically the judges have agreed in the Mahmoud case, I think incorrectly, but for now, they've agreed with the government's position, which is that he can be deported. Here, the judges are like, you cannot do this. You need to bring this man that you erroneously deported back to the United States. And their inability to do so, not inability, their unwillingness to do so is a clear constitutional crisis.
I hear what you're saying, but the thing is, when we recorded our Mahmoud episode, we were saying the same thing about him as we're saying about these people now. And my fear is that even if we did get Kilma Abreu Garcia back, even if we did get all the other people back, it's just to have the discussion about whether or not they can send them away again. And I feel like there is a non-zero chance that even if we did win this to get them to stop deporting people immediately, a lot of people would still end up getting deported.
They would, but at least then we would know the fight is worth having. I can't stress this enough. If the courts are no longer a recourse for us to be able to fight this administration, I really don't, I'm a lawyer, so maybe that's why, but I really don't know what else to do. I mean, just to double down on what you said, this is a show by 2 comedians. This is also not that funny. In many ways, this is just a show that exists to prove to my parents I'm a lawyer. However, if we cannot prove to this administration that the courts are worth listening to in order to show some sign of moderation, then one, I think we need to really ask ourselves what it means to live in a constitutional republic that is a democracy. And what happens if our governments stop listening to our government?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where like it is repeatedly demonstrated that people are very unable to identify fascism and genocide and all these other things in real time. And I know this is not a genocide, but like when you look at like Israel and the stuff that's happening there in Gaza, and it's like, well, no, that's not what's happening because like the Holocaust was 80 years ago and that looks exactly like it looked then in no other way. Oh, fascism looks like Russia or whatever, or at least whatever they want to say, because these people are not looking deeply into the concepts behind fascism and what it means. And it's so frustrating because I don't know if you can have a clearer image of what fascism might look like than plainclothes officers without identifying themselves or their agencies, taking people out of their homes off the streets and shipping them to another country. I don't know if you can have a more clear demonstration of, that's the world we said we didn't want to live in. And people aren't seeing it. I mean, people are seeing it, but not the majority. Or at least not the majority of people who can do anything about it.
And it really is the thing of, this is a time when I think the conversation needs to start happening of having more national boycotts, of more national participation from the people who do care, until people realize this isn't an issue they can gloss over. Either the Constitution matters or it doesn't. Even in their arguments of like, oh, really, we're not allowed to deport a terrorist? It's like, not if he hasn't done anything. No, you're not. I don't know what to tell you. According to your own rules that you feel that we should abide by, this is not a thing that can be done. And if you guys are going to do it, there has to be a response. Otherwise, there is no reason for them to stop.
So is there anything that we can do as citizens to try to stop this from happening?
Here's a thing you can do in the short term, which is that Senator Van Hollen of Maryland, which is where Garcia is a resident, is now going to be flying down to El Salvador to see if he can help figure out what the deal is with Garcia, to see if he's okay, to see if he's even still alive, to see if he can talk to him, to see how he's doing, and to see if maybe he can figure out a way to get him released under his own custody. Quick update on the case. Senator Van Hollen has now already gone all the way to El Salvador to see Garcia. Now, earlier in the episode, I actually mentioned that I have this conspiracy that El Salvador is getting paid by the United States government, and this is a way for them to make even more money. And it turns out, all of that's true. Looks like I nailed it. This is why we thought we'd update the call to action, actually. So one of the great things that Maryland Senator Van Hollen did is he's actually talked about the ways in which we all can do more trying to respond to something like this. So, for example, the number one thing to do is El Salvador is not making that much money from the United States. Reportedly, this deal is worth $15 million, which feels unbelievably low. So the number one thing you can do is just start to boycott any goods and services you see from El Salvador. And also, for any listeners that we have here, stop taking vacations to El Salvador. One of the craziest things Senator Van Hollen noted is that visits to El Salvador for vacations have gone up since Bukele became president, and they've gone up even further since Garcia was sent to jail. To prison. And that has to stop. So, please, no one visit El Salvador until they start, treating the occupants of this prison with the very basic human rights they deserve. And, of course, as always, please do call your congressmen and senators and make sure they support Van Hollen. Make sure they support going down to El Salvador. There are other people who are in this prison who have committed no crimes. Make sure your representatives believe that not only should they work harder to ensure due process is given to every single person in the United States, but that if the government tries to not give them that due process, that they fly all the way to El Salvador to visit these people and try to do whatever they can to secure their release.
Yeah. Well, you know what they say, Sid. It's always darkest just before dawn, but sometimes it's darkest just before dark.